Welcome to our first video cast for Unit 2, Institutions of Government. We will be discussing the Congress in the next 5 episodes. It would be a very good idea to get to know Article 1 of the Constitution like the back of your hand. In this episode, we are looking at the roots of government. The learning objective is that you will be able to trace the roots of the legislative branch outlined by the Constitution of the United States. The Great Compromise, otherwise known as, yes, you are correct, the Connecticut Compromise. This compromise established a bicameral legislature for our national government, made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate. Let's look first at the House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 2 is where you'll find the information pertaining to the House. This chamber or house, the representation is based on the population within the state. So apportionment is based on population. This is part of the Virginia Plan, or Large States Plan, proposed at the Constitutional Convention back in 1787. The House has a total of 435 members. The Constitution provides that each state will have a minimum of 1 member in the House, and then the apportionment calculation divides the remaining 385 seats among the 50 states. Congress decides the method used to calculate the apportionment. Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution states, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among several states which may be included within the Union, according to their representative number. The actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of Congress of the United States, and within every subsequent term of 10 years, in such a manner as they shall be by law directed. Therein lies the primary mandate of the United States Census, apportionment to the House of Representatives. Since the first census in 1790, 5 methods of apportionment have been used. The current method uses the method of equal proportion, was adopted by Congress in 1941 following the census of 1940. This method assigns seats in the House of Representatives according to a priority value. The priority value is determined by multiplying the population of a state by a manipulator. For example, following the census of 2000, each of the 50 states was given a seat out of the current government total of 435. The next 50 first through 385 seats went to the state with the highest priority value. So the 51st state, or the 51st seat, became the second seat of that state. This continued until all 435 seats had been assigned to a state. This is how it is done. You must be at least 25 years old to hold a position in the U.S. House of Representatives. You are able to run for the House at 24, but you have to be 25 at the time of taking the position, being sworn in. Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution provides the House with the authority to determine whether members elect are qualified to be seated. For instance, William Claiborne of Tennessee became the youngest person to ever serve in the House when he was elected and seated in 1797 at the age of 22. The House also seated Claiborne at the age of 24 when he won re-election. The House, however, has not always been so lenient. Representative John Young Brown of Kentucky was the first elected to the House in the 36th Congress, 1859 to 1861, when he was 24. But the House refused to administer the oath of office to him until he was 25, after the first session of Congress was over. You must live within the district you are going to represent in the House. We here in Beaufort, South Carolina, live in U.S. Congressional District 1. So if you wanted to be in the House of Representatives for District 1, you must live within that area. You can see on the map what areas incorporate U.S. Congressional District 1. Article 1, Section 7 states all revenue bills must start in the House, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments, as in the case of all other bills. This is known as the origination doctrine. The origination clause or doctrine, sometimes called the revenue clause. Why did the framers do this? Glad you asked. The framers did this for the House's closeness to the people and the fact that they represent districts rather than whole states. Also, this is the only chamber at the time directly elected by the people. To serve in the House, you must also be a citizen for at least 7 years. As a member of the House, you serve a two-year term. No term limit has ever been established, so they can run for re-election as many times as they want. And as long as they are elected, they get to serve. Now let's turn to the Senate. Article 1, Section 3 tells us about the Senate. Membership in the Senate is based on equal representation. This was based on the New Jersey Plan or the Small States Plan. Every state, no matter the size, will have 2 senators. There is a total number of 100 senators in the United States, and this has been the number since 1959, when the last state, Hawaii, entered the Union in August of 1959. You must be at least 30 years old, live in the state you are representing, and at least a citizen of the U.S. for 9 years. When the Senate convened on November 16, 1818, it set a record that is never likely to be broken. Members on that occasion, however, probably did not realize they were making history and violating the Constitution in administering the oath of office to Tennessee's 28-year-old John Henry Eaton. The framers of the Constitution set the minimum age for Senate service at 30 years. They arrived at the number by adding 5 years to the 25-year minimum they've established for the House members, reasoning that the deliberative nature of the senatorial trust called for a greater extent of information and stability of character than would be needed in the House. Apparently, no one asked John Eaton how old he was. In those days of large families and poorly kept birth records, he may not have been able to answer that question. Perhaps it was only later that he determined the birth date which now appears on his tombstone, confirming his less than constitutional age. Had someone in 1818 chosen to challenge his seating, Eaton could have pointed to the Senate's 1816 decision to seat Virginia's 28-year Olmsted Mason or the 1806 precedent to admit 20-year-old Henry Clay. Within a few years of Eaton swearing in, the Senate began to pay closer attention to such matters. This issue then lay dormant for more than a century, until 1934. Rush Holt was elected. He was a 29-year-old West Virginia Democrat. During his campaign, Holt had pledged to wait 6 months into the 1935 session until his 30th birthday to be sworn in. While he was waiting, his defeated Republican opponent, former incumbent Senator Henry Hatfield, filed a petition with the Senate charging that Holt's failure to meet the constitutional age requirement invalidated his election. Hatfield therefore asked that he be declared the winner, having received the highest number of votes among other eligible candidates. The Senate dismissed Hatfield's argument, observing that the age requirement applies at the time of oath-taking rather than the time of election, or the time that the term begins. It also reiterated that an ineligibility of winning candidate gives no title to the candidate receiving the next highest number of votes. On June 21, 1935, Holt followed in line of Eaton, Mason, and Clay as the Senate's 4th youngest member, beating by 28 days the 5th youngest member, William Wells of Delaware, who took the oath of office in 1799. In January 1973, the distinction of becoming the 6th youngest and the youngest since Holt at age 30 years, 1 month, 14 days, went to Delaware's Joseph R. Biden, Jr. The term limit for Senate is 6 years. Elections are staggered, with 1/3 of the senators up for re-election every 2 years. No term limit has been established for the Senate either. When the Senate was first established, senators were chosen by the state legislatures. The 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913, changed this to direct election by the people and the state they represent. If a senator leaves office, in other words, retire, forced out, or dies, prior to his term expiring, the governor of the state he or she represents then names a replacement for the remainder of that senator's term. Here's an example. Senator Jim DeMint of South Carolina resigned his position in the Senate with 2 years left on his term. Senator DeMint then became president of the Heritage Foundation. So that's why he left the Senate. He left the Senate to join another organization. Governor Nikki Haley named newly elected Representative Tim Scott of Congressional District 1 to take the remainder of Senator DeMint's open seat. As a result of Scott's appointment to the U.S. Senate by Governor Haley, South Carolina Congressional District 1, the seat was now open, and a special election had to be established to fill the seat. So South Carolina had to call a special election in order to fill the seat. Ex-Governor Mark Sanford ran for Congressional District 1's open seat, and he won the special election. Apportionment. Article 1, Section 2 explains that apportionment or enumeration should be taken 3 years after the first meeting of the Constitutional Convention, and every 10 years thereafter. So 1790 was the first census. A census shows the population of each state as well as the demographics. The census must take place, and every household is required by federal law to comply. So, whenever you get the paperwork for the census, and now we can fill in the census online, which makes things a whole lot easier, we must comply because the federal law tells us we must comply. They're not going to arrest us. It's just going to cost the United States more money. Here's an example. In 2010, only 72% of households responded, causing the U.S. government to spend more money hiring workers to follow up with the non-respondents. The state of Wisconsin had the highest number of respondents, with 81% of people in compliance, or households in compliance. And Alaska had only 28% of its residents in compliance. In other words, Alaska was the least compliant state in the 2010 census. What the census does is it helps the government determine how more than $400 billion of federal funding each year is spent on infrastructure and services. The census also determines if states are reapportioned. In other words, is a state increasing its representatives, decreasing its representation in the House, or is that representation staying the same? If a state is reapportioned, in other words, gaining a member in the House of Representatives or losing a member in the House of Representatives, redistricting must take place. Redistricting is where we draw new district lines. Reapportionment also shows population shifts within states. So, in the 2010 census, we're finding out that some states lost population, some states gained population. Here's an example. South Carolina, as a result of the 2010 census, showed an increase in population, thus earning a 7th seat in the House. The district then had to be redrawn. So the state of South Carolina's districts, congressional districts, had to be redrawn on our map. And it was redrawn to establish a 7th district. Prior to this, we only had 6 representatives in the House, so therefore we only had 6 districts. Because our population increased, we got the 7th seat, which means we have to redraw the maps, redistrict, in order to make the 7th congressional district. Once the districts were withdrawn and approved by the governor, now we had to send that redrawn map with the new district on it to the Supreme Court for approval. Reason why we do that is because we have to make sure we're following the rules for redistricting. Here are the rules. Number 1, congressional and state legislative districts must be apportioned on the basis of population. So you can't have one area larger than another when you draw it. District lines must be continuous. In other words, we can't draw a district line, a district here and add another district in another area. It must be one continuous area. Purposeful gerrymandering of congressional districts to dilute minority strength is illegal under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In other words, we can't draw these districts where minorities are going to be suppressed in voting. Gerrymandering is the legislative process through which the majority party in each state house tries to ensure that the maximum number of representatives from its political party can be elected to Congress through redistricting. So they're purposefully drawing the lines to get themselves into office, or their party into office. Redrawing of district lines for minority representation is constitutional if race is not the predominant factor over all other factors that are part of the traditional redistricting, including compactness. Now let's turn to the powers of Congress. The powers of Congress are found in Article 1, Section 8, and they're known as the Enumerated Powers. The Necessary and Proper Clause is found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. It's also known as the Elastic Clause and allows the U.S. to establish any laws needed to run the government. This is known as implied powers. Article 1, Section 7 states that all revenue bills must originate in the House. We've already brought this up, so I'm not going to go any further. If you need to review, back it up. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 explains that the Senate has the power to hold impeachment trials. A 2/3 vote is needed to convict, remove someone from office. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over presidential impeachments. We don't want a biased VP saying, "Hey, I'm gonna vote this person out. I'm gonna rule he's guilty because I want the position of the president." What is impeachment? Yet another good question that you've asked. Impeachment is punishing a person who holds the trust of the people. So if the president breaks the law, he holds the trust of us. We can go through impeachment if it is proved necessary. How does the impeachment process work, you ask? Hey, really simple. The House investigates by going over the evidence in hearings. If the House determines there is enough evidence, it will bring forth charges of impeachment, the articles of impeachment. Once the articles of impeachment are drawn up, then we move to the next step. But before we get there, I know you want to know who can be impeached. So here it goes. The President, VP, and other civil officers, including federal judges, who commit treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Wow. That last part, other high crimes and misdemeanors, is broad and vain. In other words, the last part, other high crimes and misdemeanors, led the way for the Senate to impeach, or the House to go through the impeachment process on presidents they may not like. Think President Clinton. Okay, just think President Clinton, blue dress, Monica Lewinsky, that whole scandal. What happens if they are convicted? They are removed from office, nor can they hold any other office. They may be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to the law. So, if they're impeached, we can have a criminal trial or a civil trial take place afterwards. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 gives the Senate these two powers: advise and consent power. And what that does is the Senate gets to advise and give consent to presidential nominees. This is the power for confirming major political appointments, such as federal judges, Supreme Court justices, ambassadors, and cabinet and sub-cabinet positions. The Senate just needs a majority vote for confirmation. Got that? Majority vote confirmation. Ratification treaty power. Here, the Senate must have a 2/3 vote to ratify a treaty. So the Senate is given the power for ratification of treaties made by the President, and we need 2/3. You can figure out that magic number of 2/3 yourself, to ratify treaties, therefore that all the states must comply with. The Treaty of Versailles of 1918 was never ratified by the U.S. Senate. So the U.S. had to make a separate treaty with Germany to formally end World War I. Wow, that was a lot of stuff in a short amount of time. So today we went through the roots of the legislative branch as outlined by the U.S. Constitution. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. If you have any questions, make some notes and ask me in class. Thanks, have a good day, and catch you on the flip side.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.